It's our guiding belief that everyone should have the information, the rights and power to shape the role of innovation in this future. The media in Africa plays a central role.
For a sustainable future, and from the goodwill messages.
Can you provide? I've had an interesting and largely accidental career. I'm not a computer scientist, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a Harvard MBA. However, I have worked at the bleeding edge of media, technology, and policy for 50 years. I've made more mistakes than anyone here. Sometimes painful mistakes, nearly always useful mistakes, which I hope means I might have a better understanding of the questions we might ask ourselves as we move forward. As media technology progressed from the printing press to radio to television, it became easier and easier for people to consume more and more information. However, publishing or broadcasting information continued to be the privilege of the very few. For everyone else, expression was constrained to a circle of friends. Maybe you could mail a newsletter. The public square was top down, not bottoms up. The internet changed that. It made an entire world of information available to anyone with access to a digital device. But more significantly, it put a printing press in everyone's hands. Everyone had the opportunity to share their voice in the public square, and they did. You could reach every person in the world if they were willing to listen to you. Think of it as the principle, as the very raw principle of free expression come to life, good, bad, or indifferent. It changed how people communicate, how we learn, how we influence each other, how we manipulate each other. It changed how we are informed of the issues of the day, how we form opinions about the issues of the day, how we develop perceptions of the world around us and of each other. In a world with unfettered free expression, the nature of both public discourse and political engagement changes. Yes, the internet can elevate noble speech, that which appeals to our better angels and allows us to find consensus. But it also enables heinous speech, where anger, outrage, or self-righteousness can fuel a hatred of others. Sadly, it is far easier to stimulate an audience with intensely emotional content than with any nuanced, complex analysis. We are, after all, tribal beings. We think first through the filter of what our friends, our tribe, expects us to believe. We think first, as Daniel Goleman expounds, through a social construct. If the head of the tribe says the moon is green, one would be inclined to agree, lest you not receive a leg of the calf that night at dinner. Emotions tend not to prioritize accuracy. We easily fall prey to misinformation. These are not new trends. They did not begin with the internet. They are not representative of any particular ideology. It is who we are. From a mass media perspective, there is a core principle at play here. The mathematics of the information space in the world of the internet has changed. As a society's access to media becomes more open, the media space becomes intrinsically, mathematically more divisive. We can choose and do choose the voices that reflect our view of our world, that reflect and confirm our biases, good, bad, and indifferent. When the internet happened, it broke the information space into 1 million shards. We went from 500 channels of television to more than 1 billion websites. The vast scale of the internet challenges us like never before. It challenges our core understanding that supporting free expression means accepting the existence of expression we find uncomfortable, indeed heinous. Sadly, I fear that principle is espoused by many, but believed by few. But I also recognize how the harm of disinformation may have shifted that perspective. An emotional response, but not necessarily a logical one, because at core of that is how we control free expression, which is a paradox. Let's talk about artificial intelligence. The scale and complexity of the information space will expand further with machine learning and generative language models. The technology is upon us. It has been for a long time. There are many language models, including many from sources we're not even aware of. The need and the challenge to develop better models to generate constructive content is important. The need to develop better models to help identify the malevolent content that will be created is equally important. What we see today, for the most part, are language models, not knowledge models. They are predicting the next word in strings of text based on modeling of human expression. That will change. The language models will continue to evolve. The language models will then be mapped against known knowledge data sets, or what some refer to as grounding models. This is what we're doing today with Bard at Google. And the various providers of those models will evolve, importantly, how they analyze and interpret the queries that each of you use those tools to ask questions and get answers. That last vector, from Google's perspective, is at least as important as the others. At Google, understanding what your search query is has been key to our work for 25 years. Understanding the query, determining how best to answer that query. There's a big difference in answering a simple query like, how can I bake bread, versus how should we address climate change? There's a difference between informing people and telling them what to think. Matters relating to personal and societal health require special consideration. Matters of competing societal perspectives are more wisely addressed with diverse voices expressing diverse perspectives, which I believe is why we're all here. Will the many available generative AI tools further facilitate the creation of misinformation and disinformation? Assume they will. That should not surprise us, given the progression we have seen with the internet's broad embodiment of free expression. Yes, determination of the provenance of the source of that AI content, whether it be an image or a paragraph, will be very important. In most cases, however, the more useful path will be determining the reputation of the source publishing that information. What tells us of that source's reputation? How does the context impact that assessment? We have parody, we have serious expression. Hard to tell the difference. How might we detect patterns of endorsement, or conversely, patterns of coordinated disinformation behavior? That's our job at Google, as will be yours as well. This impact of generative AI on disinformation will add further urgency to regulating such behavior, which will engender its own set of challenging consequences, and I'll touch on that as well. Let me talk about AI and the future of local news. Like all technology, generative AI has value, even as it intrinsically has no values. That's on us. That's on you. There is value in generative AI in the domain of news, particularly local news. I've worked closely with emerging digital players around the world. A particularly successful one is a fellow named Jeff Elgie and his 10-year-old company, Village Media, in Canada. He now owns profitable, ad-supported news outlets in more than 30 cities. His sophisticated platform supports more than 100 others. Village has developed and is now testing generative AI tools to enhance newsroom output. to suggest headlines optimized for search and social audiences, to craft story summaries for those social posts, to draft service journalism stories that follow their editorial policies and draft an article, say from a press announcement about a new restaurant or a local business, to draft narrative stories off of data, be that local police blotters or the box scores of high school basketball games. Jeff's objective is to expand how Village addresses the broad range of information desired by the communities Village Media serves. Jeff's proven belief is that the key to trust and the path to sustainability is to become the go-to information source for his communities. He believes his news sites must go beyond accountability journalism to gain broad audience reach that will generate ad revenue to pay for the journalistic work and broaden the audience for that accountability journalism. There is great opportunity and business value in enriching the fabric of a community by addressing the overall information needs of that community. I fear we don't use such approaches, if we don't use such approaches to bridge the divides in our societies, the important accountability journalism we do produce will not be heard beyond the depths of our own silos. Relevance. Journalism is facing a crisis of relevance. How can journalism play its role of enabling informed societies if its efforts are not perceived to be relevant and valued? The Reuters Institute tells us that less than 10% of our societies regularly consume what we call serious news. Google tells us that less than 2% of search queries are about matters of serious news. How can we reach those who don't care or lost interest? We hear it from our friends. They avoid the news. It makes them sad or anxious or fearful. They find solace in other ways, binging on the latest television series or feeding their addiction to TikTok. I do as well. How do we build trust in an untrusting world? How do we address the challenge of the other without being perceived as someone else's other? These are critical questions. Can we evolve the narrative structures of news to convey its constructive value, such as pursued by the journalists who work with the Constructive Journalism Institute in Denmark? Might we consider our linguistics such that we don't amplify societal divisions versus bridging it? Do we need more news talk shows called Crossfire? How might we adapt to the media forms our cultures are adopting? The underlying assumption of a democratic society and the profession of journalism is this: if we express our ideas with the right words and the right logical arguments, and if enough people read those words, then our democracies will be effective, the world will be a better place. But again, the internet and new media forms have rearranged social, political, and cultural structures. We see it with social media. We see it with short-form video. The messages get shorter, in an inescapable progression or digression, in the view of some, of how we communicate, how we understand the society we live in. We can't ignore it. Kevin Munger argues that forms of human conversation have an overwhelming influence on what ideas we can conveniently express. And what ideas are convenient to express inevitably become the important content of our culture. I'm not suggesting that TikTok and its peers are the future of journalism, though those media forms, as you know, are sources of journalistic expression, whether you or I are comfortable with it or not. We need to adapt to the language constructs of our time. Maybe some of our formats are closer to that than we think. Last night I was talking to Iban Aleshinloye from the Premium Times, editorial cartoonist, Isn't the shortest form of journalism the editorial cartoon? Is there not a future in that? Can we not apply some of these techniques to working with short-form media and expressing new generations who are more comfortable with those forms? I recall what Neil Postman wrote about television in 1985. We are amusing ourselves to death. In that book, Postman made the following observations about our cultures that resonate all too loudly today. What George Orwell feared, the author of 1984, what he feared were those who would ban books. What Aldous Huxley feared, the author of Brave New World, was that there would be no reason to ban books, for there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared that those who would give us so much that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared that truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared that the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. As Huxley noted in Brave New World Revisited, the civil libertarians, always on the alert to oppose tyranny, fail to take into account man's almost infinite appetite for distractions. In Orwell's 1984, Huxley added, "People are controlled by inflicting pain." In Brave New World, they are controlled by inflicting pleasure. In short, Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. It was one of the great Greeks who said, "Our open societies, our democracies, will be destroyed by the freedoms we enable." Wise words, terrifying words. They hit a little too close to home. The political sphere, as you know, has adapted to the capabilities of the internet to speak to voters, to build political alliances far more quickly and effectively than the world of journalism. We see the impact around the world. The trend is concerning, as concerning to me as it is, I'm sure, to you. While the journalism community strives to rethink its role in our digital societies, as we must, governments around the world are considering how to manage the information space in their societies. Understandable. However, it engenders a range of questions regarding the impact on a free press, on free expression, on the openness of the internet itself. I spent the last decade circling the world, working with journalists, working with publishers, working with various stakeholders on the future of news and evolving internet policy. It has been an illuminating experience, an experience of tremendous privilege. Nothing matches the challenging complexity our digital societies face. They are deep and structural, and not necessarily what we think they are. We need to be thinking in years and decades, not weeks and months. Quick fixes are often not more than wishful thinking. At worst, they may result in damaging the foundations of the press freedoms we seek to protect. In my global travels, I've learned many lessons. I've learned that perspectives on free expression vary. I've learned that approaches to governance in open societies vary. I've learned it's unwise to suggest that the US's First Amendment is the only and correct codification of free expression. I've learned it's unwise to imply that the form of democracy we follow in my country is the only and correct one. Societies are different. The challenges are different. There is no one-size-all set of answers. As with the challenge of disinformation, we are as impatient as we are concerned. Exigency tends to bypass thoughtfulness. Dangerous, given the paradoxical questions and untoward secondary consequences. How does one manage free expression in a digital world? How does one manage press freedom in a digital world? That last question might better be stated as, what flavor of press freedom do you want in your society? Does your flavor of press freedom work without open access to the distribution and consumption of information? Is it too late to reverse the splintering of the internet into sovereign domains? Can we assure the continued openness of the web while in some countries like mine, we fight over what books are allowed in libraries? Can press freedom be maintained as legal mechanisms are crafted to address misinformation? Where does one draw the line between awful and lawful in a divisive political world teeming with extreme parody and threatening outrage? How do we address the overlap between what Jamie Susskind describes as the hinterland of naughtiness with a walled garden of legal expression? Can regulation work if exemptions are granted for politicians or the media? Might such mechanisms be used against the press by less well-intentioned leaders? Does what we see in the United States with politicians attacking disinformation researchers give us further hint of the paradoxical challenge? Another public policy matter stems from the belief that the sustainability of journalism demands regulated financial support. Mechanisms have been implemented and others proposed that require certain intermediary players, such as social networks, such as search engines, to provide that support. I'm fully willing to provide support. The approach matters. The approach matters. How do such approaches enable the press but not create political or legacy bias? Will any mechanism actually benefit quality journalism, or will it simply preference embedded players? Will emerging voices, who you represent in many cases, be stifled by those embedded players? Is your flavor of press freedom one where press freedom is managed by a press association, as we see in some countries? Who is allowed to be a journalist? What are the journalistic principles they are asked to uphold? How are those enforced? How does the association restrain or stimulate the emergence of new voices and new players? Will remuneration rights, such as copyright, benefit the creation of quality journalism for local communities, or will it disproportionately support high-volume producers of a vast wasteland of digital content, including what many will consider misinformation? We are at a seminal point in the evolution of digital societies. We are at a seminal point in the role of the press in those societies. Are we considering these questions with the thoughtfulness and care they deserve? One last observation. I've been reading a lot of history of late. Always interesting, always the same. We seem to decline every opportunity to learn from experience. Instead, we determinedly repeat, indeed acclaim, past misbehavior. It's rather damning of the future of our societies. Today, people speculate about the dangers of the internet, or more recently, the dangers of AI. It would be more accurate to admit that we are concerned about the dangers of ourselves, not the machines. The AI models being built are learning from the vast expression of humankind, both principled and not, sometimes in quest of a common good, often not. But that is the history of our species, is it not? How do we execute our work as journalists, as search engines, as policymakers, and not fall victim to the same dynamic, looking backward and not forward? Sometimes learning, sometimes not. What are the underlying principles being pursued? To what extent are those principles truly about the common good versus specific or self-interests? We must think beyond the memes. We are at a seminal point in the evolution of our digital societies. We are at a seminal point in the role of the press in those societies. May we consider these questions with the thoughtfulness they deserve. I thank you for listening.
Please, once again, a round of applause for Richard. I was expecting several answers, but I know, like many of you, he's raised a lot of questions, and some of the points that he was speaking on are points that I hope we're going to get some clarity on as Dapo joins him on stage now. We need to think in